Hello, everyone. Adoption is often spoken about in quite simple terms: a new start, a second chance, a story of gratitude. And many of us grew up inside that narrative, even when our own experiences didn't quite match it. We learned quite early on that the confusion, the questions, or the discomfort didn't quite fit the story that people preferred to tell or told through a lack of understanding and education. I'm Lara Leon, adopted person, therapist, and the author of Adopted and Seen. And today I want to talk about why growing up adopted often felt complicated and why these feelings made sense, no matter what our particular adoption story looked like. Many adopted people grow up trying to work out who we are without the usual reference points. Identity isn't just facts about birth or a name, although those definitely influence it quite significantly, but it can be about temperament, humour, instincts, values, reactions, and preferences, things that often come from our biological and cultural beginnings. But many of us didn't grow up with people who shared those traits, so we learn to guess and we learn to adapt. We are, as I've said many times, are we adoptees or are we adoptees? Because we adapt so well. We try to make sense of feelings or behaviours that didn't really often seem to match the environment that we were in. For some, the differences were subtle, but for others, especially those adopted across race, culture, or country, the differences were obvious to everyone around them. Either way, not seeing ourselves reflected in the people around us can make us question our own instincts and feel slightly out of place, even when nothing looked wrong or off from the outside. Many adopted people feel different internally. Others also experience difference externally through comments, questions, or assumptions about appearance, culture, or family relationships. When we lose access to all of this, our culture, our language, heritage, or community for many, it creates a gap that isn't just about information. It affects our sense of place. We don't always know who we look like, where we come from, or what influenced us before we were adopted. And without that grounding, many adopted people become highly adaptable. Some blend in easily, reading others well, whereas others of us can disconnect from our own needs because those needs were never mirrored or understood. And these responses aren't faults, of course, they're coping strategies shaped by the environments that hardly ever have the tools to support our earliest beginnings. Many of us heard we were chosen, and quite often that is something that's said with care and with love, but for many it creates a kind of pressure rather than a comfort. I know for me this was a big question: chosen why, chosen how, based on what options, based on what, things was I chosen? And what if we didn't really feel chosen at all? When the story focuses only on being wanted, there's very little room to talk about the loss, the confusion, or the reality that adoption brings through that separation. Because if the adults around us avoided or didn't know how to engage with those conversations, we also learned from those adults to avoid them. And we learned that questions might be received as disloyal and that difficult feelings didn't quite fit the prevailing narrative, the feeling within the environment that we were being brought up in. And this leaves adopted people really unsure about whether their experiences are valid. And I have heard this so many times, because the story that we are being told or the story that we're hearing, the only words that are being spoken don't quite match how we're feeling inside. School can bring these issues to the surface in ways that very few adults recognised. Things like family tree projects, medical history forms, lessons about inheritance, questions about who we take after, drawing your family. And some adopted children became quiet and tried not to draw any attention to themselves. Others expressed their feelings through behaviour, maybe acting out or withdrawing, pushing boundaries. And these weren't signs of being difficult, they're signs of trying to manage experiences that no one had really taken the time or had the understanding about how to explain. For others, transracial, transnational, transcultural adoptees, school could also have meant a place where they experience racism, stereotyping, or being treated as an outsider within their community and their family environment. Whatever form it took, many of us learned to handle our feelings alone and in silence. Adoption is quite often framed as if a new home or a better one can undo the impact of early separation. But research shows that early loss affects emotional development, trust, stress responses, and identity throughout life. I've covered some of this in the videos that I've already put up. And this is true whether a child was adopted at birth, adopted internationally, adopted from care, by relatives, or even later in childhood. Many adopted families weren't given full information or the support or the education to understand the impact of early experiences. And when we struggled, the adults sometimes saw it as confusing or personal, or when we did things that the adults around us didn't necessarily approve of, we were often branded as difficult or sometimes worse. Children often felt the pressure to appear settled, grateful, or fine, as though everything was just going on quite normally, and usually carrying things that they sadly didn't have the words for. And I do just want to reiterate, because I know that there are many families who adopt with the best of intentions. This is around the gap of education and understanding that still exists in so many places, including in the UK, where the education isn't there and the understanding of the families who are adopting isn't enough to be able to support the adopted child fully. And this is why it's so important. What we actually needed as children was for the adults around us to guide those conversations. We needed the openness, no silence. We needed honest conversations about our beginnings, space to ask the questions at different ages, and permission to feel more than one thing at once, really complicated things and things that we may not have had words for. Of course, as children, we learn initially from our parents. And so when our parents are not giving us that space or the recognition to be able to express the complication of the feelings that we have, they just stay inside and we end up thinking there's something wrong. What we needed was for our adoptive parents to recognize that adoption is complex, and our behaviors and our feelings and all the ways that we reacted to that were not shameful. Research consistently shows that when families talk openly about adoption, children develop healthier identities and feel less alone in their experiences. Silence teaches children that our story is something to hide, whereas the openness helps us to integrate it. And we didn't get that support, which is why understanding it now matters so much. Growing up adopted is super complicated, not because adopted people are complicated, but because early separation, identity gaps, cultural disconnection, inconsistencies in the narrative all have an impact. And understanding this isn't about blaming anyone, as I've said. It's about naming reality so that adoptees don't have to carry that confusion or shame that honestly never really belonged to us in the first place. This conversation is one way where we can start being seen, and for many, perhaps for the first time. As I've mentioned before, a lot of this is covered, and it's covered in depth in the book that's available, because I talk about the high level issues that are common to many and most adoptees, but the beginnings of the healing journey are through this acknowledgement and acceptance and understanding of all of this, and starting to understand yourself not as broken or flawed, but as somebody who has adapted extremely well in the only way that we could to a situation where we had very little support and understanding. This today has been taken from a few chapters of the book, but the most important part is that as the reader, you are beginning to understand and unpick your own story. We all need a story, and when we can get a coherent story about that, and that may not be a happy story, but when we understand our story in its fullest form and its most truthful way, from that point we can begin to move forward. And so that's what I hope this offers. It offers a starting place for readers to look at each challenge that we have navigated and to really begin to express how that felt and how things might have been different and how we can begin to move away from that now. Thank you, as always, for watching today and taking the time to listen to me. And I look forward to talking to you more on this topic very again soon.